stakeholders. Good morning. Thank you very much. You are all welcome. The agenda for today is will be unfolding as follows. That National Treasury, on Wednesday, we receive public hearings from different stakeholders, which the public hearings was in oral submissions and also writing submissions. So National Treasury will then today respond on the submissions, and then after that we will have the stakeholders to comment, and then further, if there's any further clarities that the National Treasury want to give, then we'll give an opportunity for National Treasury, and then after that we will have then the input from the members of the both committees, the National Assembly and the National Council of Provinces. So that is how the agenda will be unfolding. We will try to stick to time, as I believe that this meeting is scheduled from 9 to 12. So we'll try to work within that time framework. Thank you very much once more, all the members. Then we'll give immediately over to National Treasury. National Treasury.
Thank you, Honourable Chair, Honourable Members. Just to introduce myself, my name is Ed Gasishi. I'm the head of the Budget Office in the National Treasury. I'm going to go through a set of responses to the contributions made on from Tuesday into Wednesday. I'd like to thank the contributors as well as thank the committee on behalf of the Treasury for this process and the contributions that have come through it. To get straight into it, let me just, as usual, we outline the list of organizations that we peruse their contributions quite carefully. In many cases, these were sent to us as sort of direct submissions, and we read them, and a team in the National Treasury went through various documents, Word documents and so forth, as well as presentations that were submitted. As I go through just some of the main comments, I don't want to list the various views that were expressed. This slide aims to outline those views and just to summarize them. And so this is basically showing
recording in progress
how we have grouped these. They're grouped into 5. The first is on economic growth and reforms, as well as economic policy related issues. And there were different views in this regard, as I've outlined there in this slide. Secondly, there were contributions on matters of revenue and tax. There were also different views here. However, we considered that there was a lot of contributions around widening the tax base and supporting SARS. The third set of comments was around expenditure, especially as it relates to the ceiling as well as social protection and basic services, as well as some on infrastructure. There were contributions in respect of fiscal policy in general, including from the Parliamentary Budget Office. And finally, there were other matters that were also raised. Honourable Chair and Honourable Members, we consider that most of the comments that were received were quite similar to the comments that were received at the time of the February budget. So in that regard, as we went through crafting our responses, some of the elements will seem like repetitions, but that's because we consider that the comments were quite similar to what we saw at the time of the February budget. And in addition to that, we also tried not to be too repetitive on matters that are long-standing about policy. So for example, there were issues raised by the Parliamentary Budget Office, which have been quite consistent for actually quite a number of years. And for that reason, we consider that is those are elements that we continue to have disagreements on as we go along, but I will try and touch on them as we go through the presentation. From our side, as before I get into the specific Honourable Chair and Honourable Members, the MTBPS, as you will see, particularly in the first chapter, which gives the overall overview of the statement, recognizes two things. First, that South Africa does have a serious and growing challenge with poverty and unemployment in particular, and that some support to the economy is, for this reason, necessary in the short term. And for this reason, you see the fiscal relief package that is provided in the current year on top of the support package provided last year. And on top of that, the MTBPS outlines an unallocated reserve over the MTEF that is set aside to allow for more concrete decisions to be made on possible interventions going forward. But at the same time, the MTBPS recognizes that the challenges that South Africa faces predate the current crisis and that they are structural in nature. And this is really at the center of the economic malaise, and therefore key reforms are needed and need to be prioritized in order to raise the level of growth over the long term rather than in the short term. And so we consider that the country has significant supply constraints, and that is what drives the long run trends. And in this context, those are the reforms that must be prioritized. So that's the first thing that it recognizes. The second thing that the MTBPS recognizes is that South Africa entered the COVID-induced crisis of 2020 in an already weak fiscal position. Compare that to the fiscal position at the time of the 2008 global financial crisis, where the fiscus was on a much stronger footing and therefore was in a better position to respond. In 2020, the fiscus was in a much weaker position, and the lesson that this should that should be learned from this, in our view, is that you need a strong fiscus. A, in order to do the things that are necessary within the policy priorities of government, but B, to also be able to respond to unforeseen crises, which this was. If the fiscus is weak, the next time a crisis comes, then the ability to respond to it will not be there, and the space to respond to it will not be there. We consider that the frequency and likelihood of global crises is growing and rising, and we need a stronger fiscus in order to do that. So we cannot neglect the fiscal imbalances, including record fiscal deficits and a record debt level, which is incurring debt service costs, which are not only crowding out policy priorities, but they're also having a negative impact on private sector investment in the economy. And if we look back at the history, the outline of the fiscal history of South Africa is that since the global financial crisis in 2008-9, South Africa did spend a lot. The government spending increased significantly, and as a share of GDP, it went to record levels, and we tabled multiple years of fiscal deficits. In other words, fiscal policy was expansionary during the period after 2008. However, growth slowed significantly over the same period. We did not get growth as a result of the spending. What we did get was high levels of debt. Debt rose, and the increasing cost of servicing that debt is now crowding out other forms of public expenditure, including infrastructure and social spending. As we have indicated on numerous occasions, debt service costs are now the fastest rising item of spending, and this is having a very damaging impact. The levels of debt, as well as policy uncertainty, deter private investment, employment, and growth. And the structural constraints that I spoke about earlier, for example, the lack of reliable electricity supply, severely inhibit the ability of additional government spending to have a positive impact on growth. And what we're saying here is, in response, including to the Parliamentary Budget Office, is that it is a fairly standard macroeconomic textbook matter that if you have a supply constraint and you put in additional spending, the only thing you're going to get is higher inflation, which will have a negative impact, particularly on the poor, rather than growth, especially when we have had high levels of spending before and we didn't get growth. And the question that we've asked in the past, which we continue to ask, is why will something that did not work before work now, particularly when the structural constraints have become more severe? We consider that there is a low potential for stimulus to produce growth. Potential growth has remained below 2% for most of the last decade. And in the last 3 years, it has fallen below 1%. And this suggests that it is unlikely that additional spending will stimulate growth without increasing inflation, as I've said, in this environment of low trend growth and high debt levels, where debt service costs are so high in South Africa. And therefore, higher spending is likely to lead to higher debt service costs, because the money that you are spending has to be borrowed. And the interest that you're paying on that borrowing will counteract the impact of the higher spending that you are putting in to the fiscal framework. And so you will end up in a situation where you're back to square one in terms of the fiscal stimulus, but all that you will have is you will have higher debt, but also you will have higher levels of inflation. Now, in the context of this, we do want to remind honorable members and everybody else that the fiscal framework that we currently have has a significant proportion of it that goes towards the social wage. South Africa's fiscal policy is very much skewed towards basic social services, with about 60% of it, as I'll show, focused on the social wage. This is not common amongst developing countries. And in our case, we consider that we have a strong focus on the social wage. And while there is room, of course, to improve, it must be borne in mind that that is currently the focus of the fiscal framework. What's going to be very important going forward is, of course, addressing the composition of spending as well as the efficiency of government spending in order to improve growth outcomes, rather than just adding to spending. Coming to the issue of the structural constraints on growth, our structural weaknesses, for example, the unreliable electricity supply, which is a major challenge, high levels of concentration, market concentration, excessive red tape, and high cost of doing business are the things that limit the rate at which the economy can grow and create jobs in South Africa. Hence, you can see the levels of competitiveness have gone down compared to other countries, particularly developing and emerging market economies. And this is the key issue that needs to be addressed. And therefore, making progress on structural reforms can make a big difference in both the short and long term. In the short term, the credibility gains from implementing reforms, including those that are in the ERRP, Government's Economic Recovery and Reconstruction Plan, can be reflected in a lower risk premium. In other words, lowering the risk premium that is used by investors to determine the cost at which they must charge South Africa, the price they must charge for lending to South Africa. And therefore, this reduces borrowing costs and this frees up fiscal space. In the medium term, it would improve confidence and investment, leading to improved growth and an improved debt trajectory. And finally, in the long term, to a permanently high level of growth. Another point that has been raised in the past and now is around taxes and tax increases. As honorable members will be aware, the MTBPS is not used to announce changes in tax policy, and has always been the case for the last 25 MTBPSs that have been tabled, including this one. we did not include any announcements on tax. These are generally reserved for the budget in February each year. Of course, we take into account these submissions. Though I must point out, of course, to honorable members, these submissions were not all going in the same direction, excuse me. They were all conflicting, but we do take them into account, and we will do so for the purposes of the 2022 budget. In terms of excise on alcohol, the government is aware that the excise burden, particularly for wine, beer, and spirits, are above the policy guidelines of 11, 23, and 36%. And the minister has announced a review of both excise duties on alcohol and tobacco. And we will be working to publish discussion documents in this regard as we go forward. Nevertheless, let me also indicate to honorable members that in the 2021 budget in February, we did indicate that we consider that at this stage, particularly with the fragility of the economy and the burden on households, particularly working households and the poor, we don't consider that there's a compelling case to increase tax rates at this time. And in previous budgets, we have highlighted that in order to increase tax revenues, which we agree needs to happen, we need to focus on broadening the tax base rather than lifting rates of taxation on existing taxpayers. So that is currently our focus. And in addition to that, funds have been made available to SARS, the South African Revenue Service, to bolster their capacity in order to collect more by reducing tax evasion and improving compliance. And as I've said, announcements on taxes will be made at the time of the 2022 budget. And when we talk about the issue of tax rates, just as a reminder to members, to honorable members, of something that we have said in the past, that when we compare South Africa to other countries, and this is important both from a competitiveness, global competitiveness perspective for investment, but also in terms of the actual burden on households and firms and businesses in the country. We've made this point before, and we do want to remind honorable members, South Africa is not a low tax country. Indeed, if you look at the slide, when we compare South Africa to other countries, particularly upper middle income countries, of which South Africa is one, which are shown in the maroon dots on the slide, you can see that South Africa is not among the lower tax countries in the world. Indeed, only Brazil amongst upper and middle income countries has a higher tax burden than we do. So we have quite a substantial tax burden on our taxpayers. And so when we think about tax rates and raising additional revenues, we take into account the fact that South Africa already has a considerable and fairly high tax burden in the economy. Turning again to the issue of the history of fiscal support, government spending versus the economy. What we have observed, Honorable Chair and Honorable Members, is that over the last decade and a half, the general trends, with few exceptions, the general trends has been that government spending has grown significantly in real terms. A lot of this has been driven by increases in public service compensation, which have been above inflation for most of the last decade and a half. But in general, real non-interest expenditure growth has been significantly above the economy and has grown in real terms for much of the last decade. At the same time, the trends on economic growth has gone down. In other words, there is a negative correlation that has emerged over the last decade and a half between increases in non-interest expenditure and the level of economic growth. South Africa's fiscal multipliers are low. And this is, of course, due to several reasons, including the spending patterns. One of the critical proposals that were made in the February budget is that we do need to change the composition of spending so that we focus more on infrastructure investment rather than consumption spending, because we consider that this could help improve these fiscal multipliers. But at this stage, those are the trends that we have observed over the last decade and a half in government spending and in economic growth. That being said, we have, as I've said, sought in this budget and in the previous budget to strike the delicate balance between addressing the very real socio-economic crises and challenges that South Africa faces on the one hand, and on the other hand, addressing the need to address the fiscal imbalances and the weaknesses of South Africa's public finances. We have to do both, and we have to balance these two considerations. And that's what we've been working to do since last year, particularly at the time of the special adjustments budget that was tabled on the 24th of June. In that context, we tabled a fiscal support package. We understand, of course, that there are different views about its size and people want more, but it's important, Honorable Chair and Honorable Members, to put this into perspective. According to the International Monetary Fund, including in its latest publications in October 2021, South Africa's fiscal support package that was tabled last year was one of the largest among emerging market countries, particularly those emerging market countries that are in the G20. And indeed, when we compare that support package that we tabled last year, it was certainly the largest as a percentage of GDP among sub-Saharan African countries. If you add on top of that the monetary support that was provided, it also presents a fiscal support package, particularly under the circumstances of a weakened fiscus that was quite significant compared to other countries. And so it's important that we put that in perspective. And these are the details that don't come from us, but they come from different institutions, including the IMF and the African Development Institute, about our fiscal package and its size. And we think that this is an important perspective. It's also important to raise the fact of, which was also raised by others, including the PBO, on the credibility of the fiscal framework. So before the global financial crisis, Honorable Chair and Honorable Members, our fiscal position was sustainable. But after the crisis, fiscal policy on average was expansionary, as I've said, for a decade. But this fiscal expansion did not result in economic growth. It resulted in more debt. And that debt service costs now consume R1 out of every R5 raised in taxes. About 21% of all the taxes that we raised are going towards paying bondholders in New York, Boston, London, Johannesburg, and various other places around the world, instead of going towards funding the policy priorities of government. And this is a direct result of the debt that we accumulated when we increased the levels of spending after 2008, which did not give us growth. And this is a critical consideration when we think about fiscal policy going forward. Turning then to the expenditure-related comments that have been made, particularly on social protection, we do want to make several comments. Government is sympathetic to the current pressures on grant beneficiaries, and we continue working to see what we can do to address the shortfalls in social grants. Nevertheless, we do want to also present perspective, which was included both in Chapter 1 of the MTBPS as well as in the Minister's speech last Thursday. Currently, over 46% of the entire population of South Africa receives some kind of social grant, which represents an unusually high coverage for a developing country. And in this regard, we need to consider that if job creation continues to be poor, particularly in the private sector, the sustainability of the system and the overall fiscal position will become a serious concern. As I've indicated, the social wage represents almost 60% of total spending in South Africa. In the current year, we've provided as part of our balancing act, additional funding to respond to the effects of the pandemic. And in addition to that, of course, we've raised the number of people who are receiving social grants, including the social relief, the social relief of distress. Increasing grants beyond current levels will require very tough decisions on reprioritization, particularly at the political level, because adjustments will have to be made. The population is currently projected to increase from the current around about 60 million to 71 million people. So the spending requirements as we go forward are going to come under increasing pressure. So how we prioritize, first of all, and also the need to ensure that we address the crowding out effect of debt service costs is going to be very, very important. And that is what our medium-term budget policy seeks to do. On questions and comments that were raised about government efficiency of spending, we would like to make the following comments. The Treasury continues to expand the tools available, particularly to provinces and municipalities, to improve their spending and to build operational and technical capacity. There's a lot of work currently going on, including as with the oversight of the Budget Forum and the Budget Council, to not only provide additional, but also to recalibrate the capacity support to municipalities in particular to improve their financial situation as well as provinces. It is important in this context to indicate to honorable members that by far the largest reason why a lot of municipalities would be in financial distress is because of management and leadership shortcomings within those municipalities. And it is difficult under those circumstances for capacity measures coming from the center to make a difference unless serious changes happen at the level of management and leadership in municipalities. In 2020, the National Treasury and the Government Technical Advisory Center helped train provincial officials to conduct spending reviews to address inefficiency and poor financial management within the provinces, and we will continue to do that. In the current year, the National Treasury will review provincial infrastructure funding policies and propose how grants, incentives, and other funding can be best structured to coordinate planning and budgeting. And this is intended to improve coordination as well as to strengthen accountability and service delivery. National government continues to support provinces and municipalities in other areas, including to help them with imposing consequences where there is a violation of public finance laws. Here we're talking about the PFMA and the MFMA. More broadly, we are, as a government, part of the Financial Action Task Force, and as we indicated in Chapter 1, we are working with the South African Reserve Bank, the Financial Intelligence Center, and other departments to address deficiencies identified. And this will be done within an 18-month timeframe that has been established by the Financial Action Task Force to address institutional weaknesses, including those that have been caused by the impact of state capture. And finally, Honorable Chair, the additional funding to SARS is meant to modernize SARS systems and to allow them to do more work to improve compliance, to simplify tax administration, and of course, in that context, to collect more revenue from taxes. Chair, let me also just indicate, as a way of concluding, that we note and appreciate the submissions. And as I've indicated, and have been at pains during my presentation, we are trying to strike a balance between providing immediate support to the economy and addressing the weaknesses in the public finances, which we don't have a choice but to do. Government has long directed the majority of public spending to address deeply entrenched challenges. And in this context, the social wage is most of the spending of government over the next 3 years. Since 2021, the 2021 budget, South Africa has benefited from a surge in demand for commodities that we export. And this increase in demand has meant that the prices of these commodities have risen, and therefore tax revenue has also increased. But these commodity price improvements are temporary. Indeed, since the end of September, we are seeing a decline in prices of key commodities that South Africa exports, including iron ore. And so we consider that the revenues coming from this benefit is also temporary. And so we have to balance also between the type of support that we provide on the spending side, given what's happening on the revenue side. In addition to that, it's important for honorable members to be aware of the fact that the revenue estimates that we are seeing are still below, well below, the pre-pandemic projections by more than more than $250 billion rands. They're still below by that amount. The consolidation presented in the MTBPS will be supported by structural reforms that unlock private sector investment and job creation. And as such, over the period ahead, government will accelerate these reforms to promote growth while keeping fiscal consolidation on course because of the need to narrow the budget deficit and stabilize debt. Restoring the health of the public finances is also critical, as I've indicated, for ensuring that South Africa is able to weather the storm of a future crisis, especially given the weaknesses the current crisis has brought. And finally, it's important to also remember that significant risks remain, both for the economy and for the fiscus. And these are outlined in Annexure A of the MTBPS, including those arising from state-owned companies. Honorable Chair, I will end there, but I also do want to indicate that this presentation, which has been submitted earlier this morning, includes a set of annexures. And these annexures provide more deep details of what I've said. But for the sake of time, I've kept to these set of slides, and I would urge, obviously, honorable members and others to go through the annexes if they want more information. But for now, I'll end there, Chair. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to National Treasury for a very comprehensive response to the public hearings in submissions. I just want to double check. So that will be the only presentation from National Treasury?
Yes, sir, that is our presentation.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me just also acknowledge the co-chair, Honorable Noxie. Now we're gonna give to the stakeholders. If you can just again list them so that we see in terms of the sequence, so that then we have their comments on the presentation. And then after, when we come back, Honorable Noxie will then take the further session on National Treasury to, if there's any further respond, and also then to take the members through the inputs. And then I think that will be how we're going to unfold. Can we list to have the list of so that we can follow in terms of the stakeholders?
I'll share my screen with the agenda, Chair.
Okay.
Also over and above that, it's the FFC and PBO. I'm not sure if they also have any comments.
Okay. Yes, I think Let me start with FFC and PBO, and then we go then to the stakeholders, which is listed from 1 to 7. If you can share the screen, but let's start with FFC and PBO. FFC. Who is ready? PBO.
Good morning, Chairperson. Good morning, Chairperson. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Good morning, Chairperson. Thank you so much. Good morning, honorable members, and good morning, colleagues on the platform. Thank you so much for I'll give a comment and I'll give my colleagues as well to also give input. Thank you so much, Chairperson, to the National Treasury for response. We really appreciate that. I think my comment, I want to start by saying we have requested a meeting with our colleagues from National Treasury, and we're still await for the confirmation to discuss some of the thinking and difference. And frankly, Chairperson and members, economic concepts, there isn't any, there's a lot of disagreement about the economic concepts and so on. So there's nothing wrong to disagree on views with the National Treasury or anybody for that matter. But I think it's quite important to really understand each other where we're coming back from, where we're coming from. That's very important. That's why I've requested a meeting with a parliamentarizing officer of National Treasury, but we're still waiting for a response. But what worries me, Chairperson and members, is the tone, which I would regard as condescending in a way of saying the textbook definition says this or the Google definition says this. I think for me, that worries me a lot, Chairperson. I want to raise here. I see it as very condescending, really. But again, we will have engagement with our colleagues from the National Treasury. But I think we should stay away from condescending text to say textbook definition says this, or that's for me, it doesn't really help the conversation going forward. I think the point, when you look at the high level panel led by Khalema Motlanthe, former President Khalema Motlanthe, it has shown actually the evidence that poverty and inequality in South Africa has worsened quite a lot, post the time where we started implementing fiscal consolidation. That's a fact. That's not really hearsay or whatever. It's a fact that poverty and inequality has worsened post the years we've implemented fiscal consolidation. And I think that's the message we also emphasize in our presentation, that look, what national development says, which is the policy that are adopted by government, it does emphasize the importance that any policy proposed by government has to be backed by evidence, or has to be backed by a social impact study, which in a way shows what the implications of policy on society, on economy, and on public finance for that matter. And I think I would have to check my notes a lot of times. I haven't really seen a contradicting report from government about what the high panel review report by former President Khalema Motlanthe said. I haven't seen any contradictory report to that fact that we've seen a high poverty, high inequality, post the times that we're saying, post the time we start implementing fiscal consolidation. And another issue I want to clarify, we've never said we're opposed to any structural reforms, whatever, but we're saying that, there has to be demand side. There has to be complement. And on Tuesday, I tried to respond to this point that what we're talking about when we say demand side of it. And it's very important that, I was privileged to sit in a meeting last month, I think last month, 2 months ago, where the Minister of Finance was presenting as well, who also advocate the importance of structural economic transformation, whereby we move our economy towards more productive sectors, support for productive sectors that enables employ more people, sectors that would ensure that there's a growth in economy. And fiscal policy has to support that approach. So what do we mean? I mean, sectors like manufacturing and all those productive sectors that we're enabled to bring more, as opposed to as this at the current stage, we have quite much financialized economy, and which the point that we're raising to say, if we say there has to be more fiscal policy over and above support of households, there has to be realization that fiscal policy has to support recovery, and the areas that will be important. It's productive side of the economy. Productive sectors of the economy has to be supported, as has the president and also the Minister of Finance have also acknowledged in that regard. One last point before I give my colleagues a comment is around the issue of social spending. Since today, I did a bit of a quick study, and I realized that actually we still do spend quite far low, as a country on social spending. Social spending certainly exclude education, exclude health, because every country spend on those aspects. It's very difficult to compare it. But nevertheless, when you narrow it down to social spending, we actually spend quite far lower compared to the countries that have higher inequality, have lower inequality than we do. I looked at some of the OECD countries, and the highest country with the country with the highest inequality, it's Costa Rica. And Costa Rica, their inequality, the Gini coefficient sitting at 0.4445 or so. That is 2019, and they spent more than 12% of their GDP on social spending. Social spending, just referring to transfers, social grants, all those, excluding those other social wage broadly, but specifically on social spending, we spend far lower. When I compare to us, South Africa, where we have higher inequality beyond 6.6%, we spend less than 7%, I think 6.2%. And with that in mind, the issue of dealing with the issue of saying we're already spending a lot, it has to really back the evidence, comparing, having more comparative analysis in that regard. And we have some of the high poverty chairperson numbers, and that's what the point we're trying to make in our presentation. I'll stop there, but I emphasize the importance that we want to have conversations, and there's no difference in differing in economic concepts. There is huge difference, but lastly, there has what we've said in our previous presentation. There's certainly we've seen global consensus, particularly during and post the COVID-19, that the role of the state has become very, very important in responding, in supporting the government, the countries, the society, in really dealing with some of the effect of the COVID-19 and related poverty issues, but also supporting recovery. It's very important, and the way to do it is through fiscal policy. I think that's what we're trying to emphasize, that what we're raising here has been seen in a global context. Siraj, do you want to come in? Thank you so much, President, members of Parliament. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Director.
Sorry, Siraj, just to interrupt you. My apology. Yes, thank you very much. I just want to in terms of managing also time, to look in terms of the following speakers, if you can maybe stick to a 3-minute, so that we just also look in terms of managing time. Thank you very much.
Siraj, just summarize, don't go too long. Yeah?
Yes,
thanks.
Thank you very much, Honorable Chair. Just to say that I heard from Dr. Olandi that she's got load shedding and the internet is really intermittent, so she won't be able to comment. So I'll try and take less than 3 minutes. Chair, thank you for giving us this time. I just want to reinforce the last point that Dr. Janti's made. You know, that during a time of crisis, and in South Africa, we talk about the crisis before the crisis, not just the pandemic, the role of the state in helping recovery and stimulating the economy is of utmost importance. And to keep thinking that you're doing it when you're not doing it, as National Treasury keeps saying, is a huge problem. And I think it also shows this big difference in thinking around economic issues we have. The first thing is I want to come to is that the word crowding out has become a fairly overused word by National Treasury. They use it to apply to crowding out the debt repayments, crowding out other things, but also they talk about it and sometimes they conflate the two. They talk about it related to how increased government borrowing is crowding out private sector borrowing. And even with all due respect, even the Deputy Minister of Finance said, imagine if government's borrowing so big and South Africans only save this much, there won't be any savings left for the private sector to invest. And this, I think, shows part of the problem. It shows that the thinking around how the economy operates is based on a view that is based on neoclassical economics and a very narrow view of the economy, a very textbook view of the economy. And unfortunately, Mr. Sishi said, this is what textbooks say about supply side, that actually doesn't understand properly how that neoclassical economics, often in their modeling, in their assumptions, they leave out the state. And so anything that the state does in the economy seems like distortionary and bad. And to have a national treasury and a government that starts their views from that perspective, rather than seeing the state as an entrepreneur and having entrepreneurial abilities, but also able to fix things that markets can't, whether you're in a crisis or not, is really important. And so there needs to be a huge rethinking in government, particularly in national treasury, about the role of the state in the economy and what crowding out means. In fact, most mainstream economists now have shifted their thinking away from that narrow conservative view of fiscal policy and say that fiscal stimulus often crowds in private sector investment, particularly in times of downturns, but they also create, and this is something that Danny Roderick, for instance, in the late 90s wrote, even before he helped Treasury with their thinking. He was saying that one of the things that is clear in the data is that the countries most successful at trade and exports are the ones that have the most social support and government spending. And it's because government ends up being the customer for a lot of things when there's a global downturn. And the role that government plays, not only in providing money through social grants and social benefits to help poor people and help people and households who are 60% of the economy to buy things is important, but they're also a major supplier from the private sector. It's a major demand from the private sector, and they also, in terms of investing in infrastructure and providing that money. And crowding in applies not only to infrastructure, but also social spending. I'm going to take one more minute, sorry, Chair, if I'm taking too long already. So one of the other issues, and Dr. Jones just point to it, is that they talk about structural reforms without actually understanding or analyzing or talking about the problems with the structure in the economy. So Mr. Edgar's comments betrays that. And he talks about how if there's supply side problems in the economy, and he talks only about Eskom here, and maybe there's a few other bottlenecks, then you're just going to cause inflation. And in South Africa, we've seen that the supply side businesses are sitting on over R1 trillion. That was what the Reserve Bank said. So they're not being crowded out. They're not investing, but they're choosing not to invest because of structural issues around the way the economy is structured, which sectors dominate the economy, the fact that a lot of their money goes into financial speculation, into real estate, into those kinds of things, and not into the productive sector. And in fact, our productive sector has had overcapacity over the last few years. So if we provide poor people with more money, they could ramp up production of less energy-intensive goods and more labor-intensive goods for poor households. And that could be one of the most effective ways. The last point I want to make about taxes, and I really, really worry about this view that we need to broaden the tax base. It's what the IMF says, it's what mainstream, very conservative economists have been saying for a long time. And we think about what that means is we don't want to increase CIT and PIT. We want to, and maybe think about higher security taxes or wealth taxes or other kind of taxes on the rich. We want more VAT. We want more taxes on more of the people, which means more of the poor people. And that's a huge problem. And this simplistic view that if putting South Africa into a scatter chart and saying, oh, see, in middle income countries, we at this level, we're already high, that I think that kind of thinking needs to actually think whether that is real empirical evidence and supported by facts. South Africa has obscene levels of inequality. The top 10% earn 7 more times than the bottom 40%. To say that we shouldn't consider more taxes and higher taxes on rich and corporations, especially those that extract huge amounts of wealth from the economy legally and illegally, is a problem. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Raj. Yeah, thanks so much, Chairperson. Thanks so much, honourable members. Thanks, colleagues. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Chairperson, we are done. Thank you.
I did it. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so
PBO.
much, Chair. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, it's a very, very constructive interaction between the PBO and National Treasury, which is very interested. And then we'll encourage the engagements between the two, so that when we come here, that we look in terms of where we meet each other. That is, we greatly appreciate it. FFC, are you there? FFC? Okay, if not, we will go then to the stakeholders. We will also apply the 3-minute. The first stakeholder as listed on the screen. You may come in. Speak. Second one, Amanda.
Thank you, Chair. May I please request to keep my video off? My internet is very unstable.
Yes.
Greetings, everyone. I'm Tlous Abba from Untitled. Thank you for allowing us this space to speak. And also thank you to Treasury for their presence and for their response to the presentations and the demand. The Untitled community's proposal is very simple, right? We say tax the rich to help the poor. We note what Treasury has said about taxes. However, we do not agree that there isn't a compelling reason to increase taxes at this time. There has always been a compelling reason, which is the majority of the people in this country live in poor conditions, especially women and children. We have constantly asked, help them. And in return, the people were asked, show us the money. And the people said, implement a wealth tax. And then experts tabled concrete plans. We note that Treasury neglects to mention that the 3 billion in additional funding to SARS was not only to modernize and improve compliance, but to also investigate the introduction of a wealth tax as per the recommendations of the Davis Tax Committee report. One can hope that Treasury is not trying to derail a wealth tax the same way it has tried to derail extending and increasing the 350 grant until it is turned into basic income support by secretly proposing a family grant, which would only go to the head of a household and would exclude millions of people. We are the most unequal country in the world. So there is both immense wealth and poverty. So the answer is simple: tax the rich to fight poverty. Globally, it has become increasingly recognized that many countries need a basic income grant. Treasury speaks of that if poor job creation continues, it will become a serious concern for the overall fiscal position. The reality is, poor job creation has been happening for years, and we as the public cannot guarantee that it will not continue. But we can guarantee that it is having a massive negative impact, and sympathizing alone is not enough. Speaking of job creation alone is not enough, or coming up with other measures speaking about that is not enough. People need to survive. And while we understand that Treasury does not make all decisions, we also want to hold it accountable for money issues in this country. What Treasury has basically said is that we know you are poor, we are sorry, but we are also in a tight position. Oh, well, whose fault is that? Because it is definitely not the people's fault. And secondly, not only is Treasury's budgets over the years anti-poor, but the way they engage the public is also anti-poor. One of our biggest issues is accessibility to public consultations. We want Treasury to try and make public comment accessible. Millions of the people who are impacted by these budgets that are tabled each and every year do not have access to these spaces. Many of them do not even know of these spaces. Mind you, we are talking about poor people who many of them do not have access to smartphones, and those who have do not have access to internet because they cannot afford data. So we want to know what Treasury will do to change this, to make public consultations and public hearings accessible to each and every person in this country. It would be great, for example, if when it is time for budgets, Treasury provides a free line where people can call to bring in their comments. This is why the Gogos have constantly asked to meet with Treasury, but that never happened, you know. And it is just a sad story because the Gogas have been going to Parliament since 2018, and they've constantly asked, please meet with us, but it has not happened. Sorry, Chair, lastly, we look forward to the budget in February, and we hope Treasury will use the power it holds to urge the government to make decisions that will help the poor, such as increasing grants and taxing the rich. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Amanda. The next stakeholder will be Hela.
Thank you so much, Chair. And I think in my remarks, I won't take much of the time. We comment Treasurer in the summary of the slide 17, the last slide on the submission regarding the health promotion levy. Although the DDG didn't speak much into the rationalization of what that would mean, we know that in the last submission in February, Treasury had committed to undergo the evaluation of the health promotion levy. So I think our comments there will be like, has the process been undertaken or started, or has it commenced? And if this will come into the February midterm budget speech. And I think as Healthy Living Alliance, we in support of the evaluation, and we would like, if Treasury would want to engage us in terms of our input in the evaluation, we'll provide that. And we believe that there is an opportunity to strengthen the country's obesity prevention strategy through this levy, and with the process at the Department of Health of actually defining what's healthy food and unhealthy food through the regulation of the front of pack warning labels, that we hope that process could be finalized urgently to support Treasury's envisage of increase to the health promotion levy to 20% and expanding the levy to other products. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. The next comment will be SAB. Just Comrade Honorable Abrams, if there's any problem on my side, I just give a indication. Okay, SAB.
Thanks, Chair. Thank you, honourable members and National Treasury for the presentation. We'd like to just start by saying that we're disappointed that the Treasury did not give specific details and answers to our submission made on Wednesday, Chair. They've given us a general presentation, much of which on the excise taxes and the tax outlook in particular have already been flagged in the 2021 budget, and we expected more details from our submission made, our written and oral submission made on Wednesday, Chair. We are aware, Chair, that National Treasury has pointed out that taxes and tax prescriptions are only made in the budget, but we are only noting and made a submission to the tax outlook presented in the MTBPS. In particular, Chair, what we asked on Wednesday was that Treasury respond to page 70 of the MTBPS that shows us that excise taxes have been rebased away from CPI towards household consumption growth. We wanted to understand exactly why excise taxes have been rebased. Secondly, Chair, we have asked Treasury on page 30 in the table on gross tax revenue that all tax categories have been able to recover back to 2019-2020 levels, except for specific excise duties. Now, we've noted that this is a direct consequence of the fact that the beer industry in particular has been affected by 161 days of being banned, and including the pandemic and the effects thereof on demand and on our ability to continue to be a business that's viable over the last 2 years. Lastly, Chair, I would like to point out to the fact that we as SAB have made capital investment of 2 billion Rand into 2022. But in spite of this, we have got little detail about the structural reforms that National Treasury is planning to close out, including what it's doing beyond reducing the bottlenecks. As the PBO has stated, we are a company that is very focused on investment and job growth. Nevertheless, Treasury has not given details as to the multiplier effects and some of the plans, the implementation plans of helping business do this. So we are struggling, Chair, with the certainty and transparency in general around the medium tax outlook and the business planning around investments that we are planning to do in this country without getting more certainty, in particular from the MTBPS and not from the 2022 budget, around what Treasury is planning to do to create a business enabling environment outside of structural reforms, but including it insofar as they're expecting investment and job growth to come from the private sector. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, SAB. Now, number 5, Outer.
Thank you very much, Chair. Sorry, my screen is looking yellow, but we appreciate the opportunity to be here. I'm not going to be too rushed, Chair, because I think we are ahead of schedule. I want to really respond to individual points that Treasury made. In general, they're really welcome, and we really appreciate that they seem to pay close attention to what the stakeholders had said, including us, and we really appreciate that. And thank you for creating the space, Chair and honourable members. First of all, I think I would like to convey strong agreement with the stated senselessness of an expansionary fiscal policy in the current situation of structural constraints. I want to qualify that, Chair, because it seems as if there's some disagreement about that. From our side, it's very clear that without fundamentally doing something differently, and without the kinds of structural reforms that Mr. Sisho was talking about, increased expenditure at the moment would really feed corruption. It would feed misspending. And I think that's a fundamental point that's missing in the response from the PBO, and it's quite concerning that this discussion, even though the debate is really good, is reduced to matters of principle. We've seen in practice, Chair, that there's a limitless list of spending programs where there is significant corruption, maladministration, and money is really being wasted. And the Auditor General is reflecting this to us on an annual basis. So we do believe that the main point that was made by Treasury is one that this committee should observe and heed. To move on, we really agree as well with the need to expand the tax base. And I want to clarify what we think that should mean, honourable members, as opposed to taxing people at lower ends of the income spectrum. I don't think that's the point. I think the point is to ensure that there are more people in employment that are actually liable to pay tax. And I think everyone who is currently unemployed would agree with that plan. The idea is surely to increase employment and thereby to reduce inequality, as opposed to simply taxing the rich and handing it over to people who are unemployed, as if our current unemployment rate is somehow something to be sustained. It is not. And I want to qualify that to say our youth unemployment rates in South Africa are astronomical. I think it's the highest in the world. And so this is a reflection of young people being unable to find employment where they would be taxed. And I think they would welcome being eligible for taxation. And this is why, honourable members, we say that the rates of taxation should not increase and that would not be the solution. We want to extend, Chairperson, what we mean by that. Specifically, we want to refer to things like the fuel levy, which has increased, and it's not really part of this process. That is understood. But there are these kinds of small additional taxes, if I can put that in inverted commas, that really are placing an increased burden on ordinary people in going about their daily business. And just the road accident fund, Chair, is an example of where that money is going, really, which is a black hole of debt. All the while, people who are victims of road accidents are not really seeing the ease of compensation that they would like to see. E-tolls is another example, Chair, and we didn't see a response to that, and I understand that's a very specific issue, but that's something where we advocate for a dedicated road funding infrastructure policy, which is the same as Sunroll is saying. So we do agree, Chair, that SA is a highly taxed country, considering the small pool of taxpayers and considering the growing population of unemployed people. This is not something that is sustainable, and the classic maneuver of increasing taxation on rich people, I do not think, Chair, will solve the crisis we are in. And again, we want to agree and welcome the statement that spending over the past 10 years has not led to increased growth, but it has also not led to increased service delivery outcomes. And that's an enormous problem, and it's still slightly unclear how that's going to change, although Treasury did talk about more support to the provinces to oversee what's happening in local government and to be more cooperative in how money is spent and governed at that level. We do welcome the fact that government extended a heavy support package, showing that it really supports the population who've been adversely affected by COVID-19 and all the other crises that we faced over the past years. But in the absence of any prospect of sustained tax revenue at high levels, this cannot be sustainable. We agree, Chairperson, that there has to be very tough decisions made in terms of reprioritization, but this has to be made urgently. This is extremely urgent. We hope to see more detail on what exactly that's going to look like to come in the budget in February 2022. And it is not such a difficult exercise, honorable members, to see where money is being wasted. It is not impossible to reallocate existing items of expenditure elsewhere where we know there is some productive outcome, there is some tangible public benefit. And just examples like SAA are quite easy to come up with, that these kinds of failures should be abandoned and that money can be reprioritized elsewhere, somewhere where people would actually feel its impact. But also in terms of more aggressive implementation of the PFMA and MFMA, we welcome that. We hope that that's going to be evident next year, and we hope that civil society can be brought to the table to assist in that regard, to really monitor municipal and provincial spending. And finally, Chairperson, we do hope to see more detail and clarity in terms of the structural reforms that Treasury is talking about in the 2022 budget, because as we've said in our presentation, all the stated intentions are very welcome, but actions do speak louder than words. There's still considerable support in the form of guarantees going to failing SOEs, and SAA and Eskom really continuing to hold the monopoly in that sector despite the stated intention to include more private investment there. These things need to be changed very quickly, Chairperson, and we hope to see that come February 2022. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Auta. And our next comments will from number 6, Syke.
Thank you, Honourable Chair, and good morning, Honourable members. Yes, again, thank you to Mr. Edgasishi for the open and honest presentation. We do really appreciate it. We're also going to enter the debate on the increase in tax rates. Again, we support broadening the tax base, as was mentioned by Ota, and a focus on evasion. So we agree 100%. Where tax is not being paid, it should be paid, whoever and wherever that is happening. And that's why we did ask for additional support for SARS to enable them to do this, because at the moment, the 3 billion provided to them is not sufficient. And that's something that we did want a little bit more clarity on in the budget, because they need an additional 9 billion, it seems. So on the tax rates, increasing it, if you look at our tax numbers, the number of taxpayers, they might be increasing, but the number of people actually paying a significant amount of tax, I think it's 7% pay almost 50% of our tax, the rich are leaving, and it's easy for them to leave. And if they're not leaving, they're taking their money offshore. So the more we do this, the less taxpayers we're going to have and the less tax we're going to have. So that's definitely not a solution. So the problem is not on the revenue. If we broaden the tax base, we sort out evasion, that should sort out the tax revenue issue. The problem is with the spending, and that's what we've been highlighting and has been highlighted in a lot of the presentations before me. So we do welcome the spend on infrastructure rather than compensation spending. We do recognize, and I think this should be recognized, that we do have a large support package, and the government did give a large support package to individuals and entities during this COVID period. But again, the spending there, a lot of it went to corruption. So it's not the income, again, the problem, the expenditure is the problem and the corruption. Again, the acknowledgement that spending more does not lead to growth, we do appreciate. It just increases our debt. Again, the spending, the money's there, it's just not being spent on the right people and for the right purposes. If we look at the grants, as was mentioned, 46%, almost half of our population is sitting on grants. And that, again, it's very difficult for a small taxpayer base to sustain this. As was mentioned by Oat and other presentations, we need to increase employment. In order to do that, we need government to spend efficiently. So we do appreciate the sentiments by Mr. Sishi that the municipalities is being looked at quite closely. He said that the problem lies with management and leadership challenges. These are serious, and so is our serious significant risk of elevated or lack of economic growth. So if we do not stop the problems that we have in municipalities, it's not just municipalities, local, national, and provincial as well, do not stop the misspending of taxpayer money, the structural reforms are not going to happen. So we also do appreciate the consequence management that he was talking about, where they will improve cooperation. And I think this is absolutely critical, the cooperation between national, provincial, and local government. And again, we also do offer our assistance to ensure that we can help wherever possible to improve compliance. I know we are helping SARS to recruit suitable people. We are helping local municipalities as well. We're looking at schools, assisting schools with getting appropriate financial training for those in the schools and for the auditors of the schools. So we look forward to helping in any way possible to improve that. Our question, though, comes on the Section 216 of the Constitution, where it's National Treasury's role to ensure that all the government entities enforce fiscal discipline. We would like more information about what exactly your plans are on doing this. You talked about zero-based budget and you talked about consequence management, but where is the implementation of that? What is what happened to the 50 million rand that was spent on the revised performance management system? Where are we going with this? What are the plans in that regard? If I look at things that weren't addressed, it's the unbudgeted amounts. So we would have appreciated more clarity. As I said, SARS, they're not going to have enough. What are we going to do with that? The contingent liabilities of the SOEs, as was mentioned before, SAA, the South African Police Post Office, is also a huge problem. The Retirement Road Accident Fund, Sunrail GPF as well. The water and sewage system, the capacity to fix that infrastructure, which is absolutely critical, and you have addressed the local municipality. So our question again, and as was highlighted by other speakers, is we don't see enough of a detailed action plan to get all these promises, high, broad promises going. And as was mentioned before, this is urgent. We don't have the luxury of time on our side anymore. Businesses need certainty, investors need certainty, and we need concrete evidence and plans so that we can see, oh, they know where they're going, they know what they are doing. And at the moment, we don't see that happening. So we do ask for more detailed action, implementation plans of these broad promises that have been made that we've seen in the past haven't always been kept. So a little bit more detail of exactly what these structural reforms are would be appreciated. But other than that, yeah, I think that's it. That's it from our side. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Saika. The last comments will be from Kosatu.
Okay. Good morning, Comrade Chair. Morning, members and colleagues. So I think from Kosatu's side, Chair, look, I mean, there are some areas we do agree with government. We agree we need to have a manageable debt trajectory. We need to have an efficiency and expenditure. We need to deal with the network and the other obstacles to economic growth. And I think we must appreciate the huge amount of money spent by government on social grants. So those are positive things. And of course, we agree that the fundamental thing we need to tackle is the unemployment rate. Chair, I think where we differ from government is our understanding what is the fundamental crisis. Government seemingly seems to think only is the expenditure level, the wage bill. Very little about the recession, the deepest recession in a century, and an unemployment rate of 44%, which is rising all the time. Thousands of companies which are threatened with closure and will close. The huge levels of corruption and wasteful expenditure. And of course, what's to be done around the SOEs and local government, etc. So I think our frustration, Comrade Chair, on the budget is that there was little new solution. So what is fundamentally going to take us out of this crisis? What is fundamentally new? Otherwise, we're just simply doing what we've been doing for the last couple of decades and praying for miracles. It seems the fundamental thrust of it is basically that if we pay nurses less, we'll somehow resolve all our crises. And these crises are multifold and they require a multi-pronged approach, not just simply pay public servants less. But yet there are some positives which we do want to appreciate. The fact that the minister said government will engage with Public Service Bargaining Council on the wage bill. They're doubling the presidential employment program to 74 billion rand over the MTEF. I think we must really appreciate and commend SARS and let's give them more resources to rebuild SARS. We are looking forward to Treasury releasing the pension early access proposal paper in the next few days and a bill to come to Parliament in February. Chair, I think what we are disappointed especially around is that there is no stimulus plan. And we want to agree with the PBO. If you're not going to stimulate the economy, then how is it going to grow? If you look at the examples of the US, they're stimulating the economy under both Biden and Trump. It's growing, jobs have been created. Same thing which has been done in China, in Russia, in Europe, etc. We seem to want to go the opposite way. The package that was there last year, Chair, we don't think we need to spin it. There was good elements to it, but it wasn't the 10%. The thrust of it was the loan guarantee scheme, and we know only about 10% of that was actually taken up at the end of the day. The real stimulus for the relief for the economy last year was from the unemployment insurance fund, which is workers' money, which government doesn't contribute to, and there was some tax relief, and of course the 350 and the social grants contributions, which are quite helpful. So, Chair, I think just to move forward on what we really hope to see, we're running out of time. I think the local election results where our ally, the ANC, got a hiding, and all parties got a hiding, to be honest, shows that the public is tired. Our own members are exhausted by promises of government. So, Chair, I think for us, what is needed in the budget in February is a stimulus plan which is going to grow the economy, to grow jobs. We hope to see a further expansion of the presidential employment program. We need to see an extension of the 350 grant, and can we begin to raise it to the food poverty line? It is the stepping stone for BIG. We need to see the ramping up of the economic recovery plan commitments, especially around local procurement. We would hope to see the pension funds access bill being there, but also, Chair, we need to see the UF being modernized. But of course, Chair, there's also a need for dedicated sector relief to battled sectors of the economy like tourism and hospitality, etc. Chair, on the network blockages, the Minister mentioned, we've heard those promises before, but we've seen little action. So how will it be different? We need to see real turnaround time there. We would hope to see more investments in SARS because that brings revenue to the state. But Chair, we think there is some space around increasing taxes upon the wealthy through income, inheritance, estate, and luxury goods imports. There needs to be a much more support given to Eskom to bring on board new generation quickly. But Chair, we also need to see a fast tracking of measures to assist Transnet and PRASA in particular, but other SOEs to stabilize and get back onto their feet. And this must also include, Comrade Chair, the retabling of the road accident fund and the RABS bills, because you can't continue this RAF burden to the economy, and we need a new fuel price regime, which is affordable. But Chair, there also needs to be real plans around how to stabilize local government, not just promises. we would hope to see much more measures around corruption, wasteful expenditure, and in particular, a revamp of the public procurement system. Chair, around the wage bill, engage the PSABC on it. There are measures to protect public servants from inflation, but also we need to see some pain on top. Let us cut the amount we pay to politicians and to management and have a single wage regime for the entire state. But we also need to see a reversal of austerity cuts to critical frontline service departments like health, basic education, the CCMA, and the DTIC's industrial financing programs. So I think, Chair, that's our proposal in a nutshell. And let me say the last thing, Comrade Chair, is that we can have all these good plans, but I think Treasury needs to also have a very frank and honest conversation with the Reserve Bank. What they did yesterday of increasing the repo rate when the economy is in a recession is simply to kick the economy down further. And that kind of assistance from the Reserve Bank really is going to undermine all of our efforts to save the economy and to create jobs. But hopefully I didn't take too long, Comrade Chair. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much to COSATU. And once more, thank you very much to all the stakeholders on their comments on the response of National Treasury. We are going to give, I will go into the second session of the agenda, which Honorable Abrams will take forward, but we'll just give to National Treasury, and then after National Treasury, Honorable Abrams will then take further in terms of giving the members of the committees their inputs, and then also then to finalize the meeting. Honorable Abrams, are you there?
I'm sorry, Chair. I'm here. I just wanted us maybe to check first whether the SMME IC group is not here so that we can leader.
It doesn't look like they're online. I sent them all the relevant emails as I did with all the other stakeholders. So yeah, he's not online.
Okay, thank you very much. Honorable Abrams, it's just to give then National Treasury to give further clarities, and then the meeting is then handed over to you. Thank you very much. And from my side, it's just to say that I think in terms of National Treasury, the last point that they made, that government has a long directed by the majority of public spending to the deeply entrenched housing and social poverty and unemployment. I think that is a key point that I would want to emphasize on. So, but we'll give to National Treasury, and then after National Treasury, Honorable Abrams will then take the meeting forward. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Chair, with due apologies, man. I think what we need to do at this point in terms of the agenda is to give to honorable members so that when Treasury responds, they respond to the comment by the honorable members as well. If you allow me, Chair.
Thank you very much, Honorable Abrams. The meeting is over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Honorable Jatu. Thank you so much to all the stakeholders who made inputs at this time. Honorable members, I am looking at you for hands, for comments, for further clarities or discussions. Okay, I'll take Honorable Ryder for now. Honorable Ryder, please, I take the stage.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. Good morning to yourself, your co-chair, other members, and all of the colleagues online today. Thank you very much for the presentation, comments, and opportunity. And I just want to say to Mr. Sishi and to your team, I thought that your response today was the most considered response that we've seen yet from Treasury. And I think that It didn't smack of the normal arrogance that we often see from Treasury. So I just want to say congratulations. I think it's generally a good reply. And whilst I think that SAB might be a little bit justified in wanting more detail, I do believe that the late distribution of the annexes that you didn't cover in your presentation may give them a little more, but I note that it's not very good news to them that you're delivering in that particular annexure. Yes, so look, I think as far as the PBO is concerned, I really, I'm afraid that I think that your bias is becoming more and more obvious, and in your response today, I think that you really appear to be forgetting the independence part of your mandate. And I think the attack on Treasury was largely unwarranted. But that's just an ongoing comment on the battle between PBO and certain members of this committee. I want to pick up on a number of other things as well, and I think that firstly let's look at Arta's comments, which highlighted the fact, and I think Mr. Sishi pointed this out quite strongly, the fact that the challenges predate COVID and the structural reform are definitely much needed. And I thought that the reaffirmation towards zero-based budgeting that's detailed in the MTBPS is quite important to note on this. And I think that if one looks at pages 4 and page 38, page 4 and page 38 of the MTBPS policy statement, we'll see that the zero-based budgeting project remains on track. I do think we'd like to see this a little bit more accelerated, certainly in terms of the pilot project, but the fact that the pilot project is kind of focused on public enterprises, I think is probably a really good place to start. So yeah, I think that I just wanted to emphasize that point and maybe ask for perhaps a comment from Treasury would be nice. I think the acknowledgement of the tax burden that was put forward by Treasury dealt a lot with some of the presentations from stakeholders, and I want to agree with Arte and Saika on the fact that we'd much rather see more taxpayers rather than increased tax rates. So yeah. Then yes, getting back to Saika, I think that the value for money in terms of municipal and provincial spending was mentioned in your response, and I think that Mr. Sishi also spoke about the management tools that are being made available at these levels. And unfortunately, I think we've seen, certainly with the tools that have been made available to local government in the past, is that those tools are only really adopted by municipalities and provinces that want to adopt them, and there doesn't seem to be consequences for those municipalities that don't want to implement management tools and controls. So I'm thinking specifically of MSCOA, where I know that still at this stage, not every municipality has implemented MSCOA. And of course, the fact that it's the guys that are abusing monies, that are wanting to hide things away, that are not implementing the tools. And I think that the implementation of any management tools or the assistance with any tools, etc., needs to be closely linked with that consequence management that was mentioned. And we really need to make sure that people are forced into compliance. And of course, Treasury, by way of holding the purse strings, has got a very compelling case to make when they're trying to enforce something. And I would urge you to make sure that those levers are pulled at the appropriate times. I think as well, I think that the absence of comment on some of the unbudgeted or the looming problematic areas of the budget is quite an important point made by Ms. Smulders. From SAICA, I think that the Hail Mary approach on the budget in terms of the contingent liabilities and so on is something that is quite concerning and certainly needs to be looked at a little bit more closely. Then, yeah, I think Kasatu introduced a couple of new ideas today, which I think maybe caught me and maybe Treasury a little bit off guard. I want to emphasize again the fact that I think broadening the tax base is a lot more important than bringing in wealth taxes and inheritance taxes, which I think should be the last thing we're doing because of the fact that intergenerational wealth transfers have been one of the things that have kept people in this country in servitude. And I think that the ability to transfer wealth intergenerationally is something that has been fought for. And the introduction of inheritance taxes or higher inheritance taxes, I think would probably be maybe counterproductive. But my biggest comment to Kasatu, Chairperson, comes around the throwaway comment that was added right at the end. And I want to just reinforce the fact that the South African Reserve Bank needs to remain fiercely independent and urge Treasury to allow SARB to remain independent and not to interfere or intervene with their rate hikes or reductions as SARB implements. I think those things are levers that are really important. The mandate is given to the South African Reserve Bank, but how they implement that mandate, I think they must remain fiercely independent. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you so much, Honorable Ryder. I see that members are covered or don't have appetite today. I'll give over to National Treasury. Edgar.
Chairperson,
there is a hand.
I did put my hand up.
Okay, you can speak. You know, your hand was not up. You can speak.
I know it was up before you closed. The reason is because I don't think it's appropriate for me to speak before others do. And, you know, normally I speak at the end so as to encourage others to speak. So I was a bit surprised that nobody else did. So basically, Chairperson, I don't want to go into a long discussion about PBO and Treasury. But if my recollection is accurate, we asked them both to meet. Now, if it is true, no, Dennis has got to think about some members being more equal than others. Actually, I think it's a ridiculous statement, Dennis. You're probably teasing, because I always speak at the end, even as a chair. Sometimes I facilitate, but I don't think a chairperson should speak first, really. And it's my right to speak. I was just very surprised that there's only one question, which is disappointing for members, but I thought it'll come in at the end, and so I do. It's to say, look, Chairperson, if I recall correctly, we did request Treasury to meet with PBO. And even if we haven't, I'd like it minuted, because I think it's our responsibility to ensure dialogue. So firstly, I cannot see why we can't say that Treasury must meet PBO within a month. The PBO is an institution of Parliament, and Treasury has no choice but to respect them, whether they agree with them or not. In fact, we sometimes agree with PBO and we don't. So I think, Chairperson, unless there is a majority who disagree, we should request that they meet within a month, which is not to say that, you know, Treasury necessarily has to agree with PBO. Secondly, yes, I agree. If this is true, Chairperson, I agree with Dumisani. If it is true, Treasury is telling them things like this is a Google or textbook definition. What do you people really know? You're academics and so on. I don't think they need to apologize for who they are. They've been appointed by Parliament. They're answerable to the Speaker and the Chairperson. They are established in law. Treasury needs to respect them. even if they disagree with them. So I agree. If that's what they're saying to PBO, that's a textbook definition or a Google definition, then I think it's correct for Dr. Jancis to say that it's condescending, if that's true. So really, Chairperson, I don't see a problem. Thirdly, it's not my understanding that independence means not having a view. And many of the things they said today are part of the course. It's part of the debate. In fact, what was previously poo-pooed by the World Bank and IMF is now part of their current terrain. Since 2008, they've been shaken. And the majority party has never, I know Treasury is at variance with the majority party, but as I know the majority party, we don't believe that the IMF and World Bank are gods. They've done good and they've done bad. And we should test them on a case by case where their policies come out. They themselves are talking about all the things PBO says. I mean, I open any pages of the business newspapers and you will see it. So I don't think PBO needs to apologize for anything it said. PBO can't trust its views on us, but it has a responsibility to encourage a wider range of approaches. So PBO can say, this is the Treasury approach. This is something you might want to think about. It's in the discourse. Finally, it's the members that decide. So I can't see anything that PBO has said today that is out of kilter with spirit and intent of the law. It'd be wrong for PBO not to say, but you know, these debates are taking place 20 years ago or 10 years ago, the World Bank and IMF would never have said that. And I don't think, Chairperson, those of us with the ANC can take our cue from the IMF and World Bank, while they're important, very important institutions, particularly in the current terrain. On the matters raised by Amandla Mobi, we've covered this before, and they have a right to raise the issues yet again. I like what Ms. Siopa says. It's not the people's fault that they are where they are. I think that's substantially true, if not almost wholly true. I agree with her. I don't agree with her that it's an anti-poor budget, but I think it's not a transformative enough budget, notwithstanding the constraints we face. In fact, precisely because of where we are, we need to avoid the social explosion that many of us talk about. And we saw in July. July will be like a little picnic, really, compared to what's to come, given the worsening inequalities in our society. We keep raising this. It's the worst inequalities in the world. And it's highly racialized, if not solely racialized. There are poor whites, so-called coloreds, or so-called coloreds have always had huge deep pockets of poverty, and Indians, right? But essentially, you know, it's in form, it's racialized, and that makes it more explosive in a country like ours. I mean, I like this idea, and we did have this. I think it's still there in some form or another, where anybody from the public can communicate to the Minister of Finance via call center, or I don't know today, these days with cell phones and so on, and propose to Treasury and the Minister what they think should go into the budget. In fact, previous ministers have every year mentioned so-and-so has said this from this part of the country, and so a lot of ordinary people get mentioned in the minister's speech. You might recall, Chairperson, it didn't seem to happen in the last 2 years or so, but maybe if that's not activated, I would like to suggest in our report that we put in a line there about the need to activate this. Well, I don't know how the really desperately poor who don't have data will communicate, but however it's done in this day and age of advanced ICT, I think, you know, I agree with her that, you know, we should look that into. On the matter of National Treasury meeting with the pensioners, I don't see a problem with that at all. In these days of Zoom and so on, National Treasury can meet with them and raise the issues. But we have covered this ground. But my understanding is certainly all of us in the majority party, and I think most of us in this committee feel that in principle, we agree that, you know, the 350 should be retained, at least, and that if there was space, more. But we can't do, obviously, what Mangla Mobi and the pensioners want. I think their demand hovers at around 2,000 plus. I don't think that's feasible at the moment, and so on. Then to Nzama, I just wanted to say, look, on the health promotion levy again, as he would know, and his organization would know, and the allied organizations will know. I mean, in principle, we agree totally with them. In practice, we have to take into account, Chairperson, you were around, I think, at the time when we did this health promotion levy. We have to balance the needs and interests of various important stakeholders. First of all, the working class, whose jobs are at stake. Secondly, the emerging African farmers in the sugarcane industry. Thirdly, the farmers as a whole, established and emerging, and the consequences for them. And, managing these balances is not easy. So here I should continue, Mr. Nzama. Raise these things. You should do it, right? But also, we have to enter into dialogue with you. You'll recall that the first time ever a tax bill was presented to NEDLAC because of COSATU's pressure and yourselves, but mainly COSATU in that circumstance because they were there, but I think the community was also there. So I think we must continue this debate. I don't think there's any disagreements, Chairperson, with the majority of us. I think it's across most parties, if I'm right. It's just what's doable, because we have to take into account jobs and farmers, established and emerging. And then, I don't agree with this view, Chairperson, that if you expand your expenditure, that it's inevitably going to be consumed by corruption. I mean, underlying that is a theory that people are inherently corrupt, that the public service is inherently corrupt, and that then, in other words, it's impossible. You can never achieve anything if you presuppose that. So I don't agree with Outer at all. And I don't like the tone and words that were uttered there, but hey, this is Parliament, and we will see. People are free to say it, but I just disagree, Chairperson. I mean, yes, there are huge levels of corruption, not least the president of the ANC has raised it. The ANC itself speaks of it. The Zondo Commission's exposed it. There's lots of mismanagement, as this committee and other committees have pointed to, as well as civil society and Outer and others. And they must continue to do their good work in exposing that. I agree that we can't be populist, but I don't agree, Chairperson, that there isn't room to, under certain circumstances, increase spending in certain areas for certain specific programs with clear outcomes. And I don't think it's inevitable that 100% of the money or substantial percent, I don't think you can say things like this, that it's senseless to expand in these times, and all that will happen is, it will feed corruption. It's a very cynical view. Finally, I think that, to come back to a point earlier, I don't think the difference between like PBO and National Treasury can simply be elevated to principles. They have a different strategy towards how we get out of this mess. And all of us, we should avoid being dogmatic. We've engaged with Treasury repeatedly that, like the response from Dr. Shishi is very impressive in this sense. It's very comprehensive, Chairperson. Few department officials give such a comprehensive reply. So we thank you, Dr. Shishi, and your team for your very comprehensive reply. It's very good in that sense. But I also say that often, not necessarily now, I agree to a less extent than Dennis does. But I agree that you've been, slightly more open and slightly more cautious and less arrogant, as Dennis says, than you normally are. But I think really, we should encourage PBO and National Treasury to be chairperson. We shouldn't stifle the PBO. Ultimately, it's we who make the decisions. We're not stooges of the PBO, and we never been, or stooges of anybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Eunice. Let me just explain the comment that Eunice made at the beginning. It's based on the fact that at the end of the discussions, in terms of the agenda, the chairpersons will have to come back and make comments. Just to clarify that as I read the chats. Okay, can I give over to National Treasury?
Thank you very much, Honourable Chair, and to members. I'm having a little bit of ups and downs on my connection, so with your permission, I'll keep the video off because I was experiencing a stuttering in the connection. Chair, let me begin by indicating that we will follow up on the matter of that Dr. Janchis was indicating the PBO's request for a meeting. We will follow up on that after this. I do not recall seeing it myself. That's not to say that it didn't come, but it's just that we'll just have to check and see where that landed. We have no issue with the meeting with the PBO. We have met and have arranged forums with various stakeholders on the budget, including, by the way, some of the stakeholders who are on this platform right now. We had a session back, I think, in September, where we were receiving comments and talking to different people in a meeting and a panel discussion. So we will be very eager to have that, and so we'll follow up on that matter, Chair. Let me also, just by way of background, indicate that obviously in responding to the comments, we did look quite closely at the presentations that were submitted. With respect to the PBO, we obviously had to look at the key points that they were making as we were responding. We didn't make any comments about Google and textbooks. I was just making that comment just to Honorable Karim's point in reference to my own reading of the relationship between supply constraints, spending, inflation, and debt. So that was not a statement about the PBO per se in any way. But in looking at the PBO submission, in the presentation, they make the point that government is unlikely to achieve its performance targets. Then they said the fiscal framework won't work, it's not credible. Then they said capacity to implement reforms, including the economic reforms in government, is poor and is unlikely to succeed. And in our view, we consider, Honourable Chair, that it's difficult to see how this diagnosis from PBO justifies adding more debt and spending. But what the PBO did indicate, which I think is a useful contribution, is, and as Honorable Karim was reflecting on it now, is that there are significant consequences to allowing a situation where the kinds of socioeconomic challenges that the country has, particularly in respect of unemployment, particularly in respect of poverty, if that's allowed to continue into perpetuity, that can have very, very serious implications for the country at large going forward. This we agree with 100%. And I think obviously there are disagreements about how we get there, but I want to emphasize again the point that I made in our presentation, which is what we're trying to do is we're trying to balance between two very significant challenges that we have at the moment. We do not believe that government spending is bad. That's not a view that we hold at all. And that's, you know, that's such an argument we consider a straw man, because we don't have that view. And we don't have a view that says that you can't increase spending in instances where we need to do that. In fact, we've proven that both last year and this year by responding to requirements for lifting the spending ceiling where we can do it and where it needs to be done by lifting the spending ceiling. So I would respond to that by saying that I think our government has illustrated that we do have certainly that view that there's a very important role that fiscal policy plays, and that remains a kind of a baseline view. But at the same time, we recognize that there is a difference between the state in which South Africa entered the current crisis, global crisis, versus how it entered the previous global crisis. In the previous global crisis, the fiscus was in a strong position and was able to respond better. Now we entered this crisis in a very, very weak position. And that reduces your ability to respond to a crisis when you are in a weak fiscal position. And so the lesson that we believe, take from all of this is that you cannot, especially when you are a small, open market economy. We are not the US, we are not the UK, we're not an advanced economy. We have very limited tools to respond to global risks and global threats. And so the worst thing that we could do is to allow a situation in which the fiscal position is denuded of its ability to respond. And that should be a big lesson that we should take from what happened in 2020. And we should restore the strength of the public finances. We also avoid making ideological judgments or judgments about people's ideological views. And what we try and do is look at the data. And in respect of the data, what is clear is that government spending increased and deficits increased between 2009 and 2019. This is quite clear. And indeed, in previous presentations we've made to Parliament, and if you look at Chapter 3 of the MTBPS, as well as Chapter 3 of the February budget review, we compare South Africa's fiscal deficits to numerous countries around the world, particularly emerging market and developing countries. And we show that South Africa's fiscal expansion on aggregate was one of the biggest in the emerging world on a consistent basis over the last 10 years. These are the numbers. Right? What is also clear is that the economy did not grow over that same period in response to that spending. Instead, what we got was more debt, and of course, interest on that debt rose. And next year, we will be spending more than 300 billion rands in debt service costs. We remain concerned that in some instances, this is ignored. There is a view in some cases that government should spend much more, that government should accumulate more debt. But we do think that even where those who make these comments make them, and of course they have every right to make them, we do believe that they have a responsibility to explain several things. Firstly, should we ignore the impact of debt service costs? Because they are, like it or not, they are having a negative impact on the fiscal framework. And that is a direct result of the accumulation of debt. Right? The second thing is, it is important to explain what should we do if we end up on a fiscal crisis trajectory. And in this regard, we have numerous countries around the world, including countries that print their own currencies, that have ended up in a fiscal crisis. And what we're saying is we should not go in that direction, because the impact of a fiscal crisis will be devastating for the real economy, and in particular, the poor. We consider that the PBO bases its views on a couple of things. They mention the idea of a global consensus on this. We don't agree that, we think that the idea of a global consensus is overplayed. When you look at what's happening in policy action around the world at the moment, and you look at the impact of inflation on monetary policy, it's not just a South African issue. We're seeing central banks around the world beginning to make reversals on monetary policy, not because of ideological issues, but because you've got to respond to macroeconomic realities. And we think that that's an important issue. I'm not sure why the PBO is opposed to us comparing the tax burden of South Africa with other countries. We consider that this is a fairly elementary thing to do when you are thinking about tax policy measures. And one of the reasons why it's useful to do that is that the issue of global competitiveness is an important issue. Investors can go to different jurisdictions. And when you are, again, when you are a small open market economy, in many ways, you have to be aware of that because our market of 60 million is not big enough to dictate where investors go when they can go to markets that have larger populations and so forth. So I think when you're comparing the tax burden in a country versus other countries, particularly countries that are in the same category as yourself, all that you're trying to do, you're not saying that you don't want to raise revenue. All you're saying is, let's consider carefully what the potential implication of the decision would be before we make the decision. That's all, I think, Honorable Chair. We do that, and we think it's a responsible thing for a Treasury to do that. Before I finish, I would like my colleague Chris Axelson to handle the question particularly from SAB, as well as other tax policy questions. He is the head of tax policy. Let me just state that, again, while we are sympathetic and we are working on what we can do on the social protection side, and we're sympathetic to some of the comments made by Amandla Dotmobi, I must say, Honorable Chair, that a couple of the comments are rather unfortunate and frankly false. Let me state for the record that the National Treasury has never said that we disagree with the Davis Committee on investigating options for a wealth tax. That is not true. It's also not true that the National Treasury has not raised taxes on the highest income earners in the country. I would refer the colleague from Amandla, as well as honorable members, to both the 2016 and the 2017 budgets. We raised taxes on the top income earners in that budget. Certainly in the 2017 budget, we did raise taxes on the top income earners. The issue that we're raising is that it's not about whether or not the tax rate is X or Y. It's about the amount of actual physical revenue that you get. Our focus is on increasing revenue because at the end of the day, that's what we all want. We want the actual revenue. There's no point in saying you are going to raise a tax rate if that tax instrument is not actually going to get you the revenue that we need. That is our approach as Treasury, is that to the extent that we can raise additional revenue, that's where our energies need to be focused on. And indeed, the increase in the top income bracket of income tax that we did implement did not actually raise the revenue that we want. Chris can talk more about it later on, but I did want to make that point. I also wanted to indicate, Chair, that as the Minister said last week, Thursday, it is also false to say that the National Treasury has somehow tried to oppose proposals on grants, or that we've tried to table a separate grant proposal. I think where this may arise is the fact that there are conversations, including conversations with external stakeholders, as well as the Department of Social Development. In those discussions, obviously different views are expressed. There's a very big difference between views being expressed in the process of determining a policy decision and saying that a proposal has been made. I think that firstly, that's jumping the gun. And secondly, as the minister indicated in his speech last week, government will make decisions on this, but we must strongly disagree with the assertion that National Treasury has somehow either stood in the way of something or that we've not gotten to that point yet. And I think that the minister's comments in respect of that last week should really be where we are. We do not make tax announcements in the MTBPS. We make them at the time of the budget. We would really plead with members and stakeholders to allow that to be the case. The tax year ends at the end of February. I think it's good for discussions to take place on taxes, but I think in terms of tax announcements, it really is more effective and better for government at large if those announcements are made at the time of the budget, as close as possible to the end of the tax year, rather than to make them at the time of the MTBPS. Chair, I would ask Mr. Chris Axelson to talk to the issue raised by SAB as well as any other matters on taxes. He is the head of tax policy in the National Treasury. With your permission, Chair. Chris?
Thanks, Chair. Good morning, Honourable Chair, Honourable Members. Thanks. I'll try and just answer a couple of these points. I think the first one that I just needed to talk to or correct was on the PBO saying that disagreeing with our approach on broadening tax bases and saying that broadening tax bases means more taxes on poor people. We would disagree with that. That isn't quite correct. We can broaden the tax base by reducing tax expenditures that the wealthy or high income individuals use. So you can reduce the deductions that high-income individuals have available to them. And by doing so, you broaden the tax base and you can increase the amount of tax you actually collect without increasing tax rates. A similar thing can be done for corporates, for corporate income tax, and we've done 2 of those measures this year where we've limited interest deductions for multinationals and we've put in a restriction on assessed losses. So those are examples where you can broaden the tax base and increase revenue without changing rates, but it doesn't mean that it lands on the poor. There were points raised about, we shouldn't be saying that there isn't a compelling case to increase tax rates now. I think this is a quote from the 2021 budget, where we did say in the 2021 budget, there's no compelling case to increase personal income taxes at this time. Of course, things change and priorities change, revenue changes. So we will obviously be looking at as many options and considering as many options and putting them forward that we can to then assess what we need to do in the 2022 budget. So those will be considered. There were also questions on inheritance taxes and estate taxes and luxury imports. In our view, inheritance taxes and estate duties are the same thing. A lot of countries either have either one or the other, and they are interchangeable in many countries. Inheritance taxes are normally on the individual estate, is on the actual estate when someone passes on. Those were increased a couple of years ago, up to 20 to 25% for estate duty on estates above 30 million, and tax rates and luxury imports also increased from 7% to 9% a couple of years ago, and we will also look at those and see if we need to make any further changes. From SAB, there were quite technical questions on the medium-term forecast. So on page 70, we do a medium-term forecast of what we think we're going to get from specific excise duties, which includes tobacco. It's not just alcohol and other types of alcohol, not just beer. We look at a lot of the relationships between tax and the actual underlying economic variables that we have. In this case, we believed it was a better indicator of medium-term revenues to use consumption rather than CPI. This has no bearing on the excise duty and what the excise duty rates will be. The assumption for those medium-term forecasts is that the excise duties increase by inflation. But we believe it's a better predictor for the medium term to use consumption compared to CPI, but it shouldn't have any bearing. So I'm misunderstanding a little bit the concern with the change there. There was questions about certainty and transparency on excise duties on alcohol. We can't, and as Edgar mentioned, we can't provide certainty on what the excise duty rate changes will be now. We don't make tax announcements now, but also there is the discretion for the minister to make changes in the budget each year. We try and have a policy guideline which gives a general view of where excise duties are going. We've been slightly outside the policy guideline, which is why the minister announced a review in these excise duty policies. We will publish discussion papers on that in terms of what our initial position is, and then we can consult, and we will consult with industry in depth on their views of those excise duty rates and what it should be going forward, and then we can talk about the multiplier impacts of investment, etc. But we will also be consulting, obviously, with the Department of Health and other health NGOs. I think the speaker forgot to mention the negative health and social impacts of excessive alcohol use and the impact that those have on society, and the role that excise duties play to increase prices to reduce consumption of alcohol, which is what we are trying to do. I hope that covers all the other questions. I can't think of any others. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, honourable members.
Okay. Thank you, Chris. Thank you to Edgar as well, National Treasury. Honourable members, we have come to that point where we now give to the chairpersons to make comments. And I think at this stage, we can all agree that maybe Honourable Karim has made his comments. Am I right, Honourable Karim?
You are indeed.
You did?
Yes. Yeah, sure. There's nothing further for me to say. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much. I can unfortunately not see other chairpersons on the platform, but maybe just to make a comment that says, even between ourselves and National Treasury, we have in the past had an agreement that for both the budget and the MTBBS, we will need more time just to engage, because at the end of the day, the duty of the committee, the portfolio committees, they have a duty to oversight government and hence enrich nation building. And we have, all of us agreed that we need to have that kind of engagement that seeks to assist oversight, because then it means the members themselves have a greater understanding of the different perspectives that inform the decisions of National Treasury. And I think because so far that has not happened, we just shoot in different directions. And yet, if we had a common understanding on the perspectives, we would really enrich the work of National Treasury. I think, ladies and gentlemen, we need to, from our side as the Portfolio Committee, just thank the stakeholders for participating. And I think what Yunus has raised in terms of the participation of ordinary people has always happened in the past, where ordinary school kids would also have their views on what Treasury does and what Treasury should do. And it has always been an interesting part of the presentation. I do not think that the National Treasury has necessarily stopped that, but maybe we need to, if we have, just activate it, because, I think we need to commend the department for the kind of commitment that it has in terms of ensuring public participation, not only of the structures that are enabled in these kinds of platforms, but also for ordinary people who are allowed to come in and make their opinions heard. I think, ladies and gentlemen, we need to, at this point also, really thank the officials of the National Assembly and the NCOP. In a very special way, I wish to also thank the researchers as well as the National Treasury. Honorable members, you are profusely thanked for making the time and also making the contributions that assist the department do the work that they are supposed to do. Thank you so much. The meeting stands adjourned.
Thank you, chairpersons.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.